Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Sociology of Health and the Family. This is week number 9, which means we're really coming close to the end now. I've been thinking about giving you an extra week just to catch up if you need it without any new lecture material. I received a few messages from students in the class requesting that, and I totally get it because I understand that some of the work that we've been doing is much more abstract than you're used to in your other courses. And so although the classes might not be quite as long, the potency of the thinking and the energy required to work through some of these ideas might be a bit more, it might be a bit more strenuous for you. And so I totally get that. So if you need some ease as we approach the end, feel free to flag it and let me know so that I can hear more voices about that sort of stuff. Happy to do it. Also happy if you like to do a sort of review maybe at the end of everything to sort of show you where we began and what we worked through as we moved through the course, to give you a sort of broad picture of everything. Actually, I think that's all I'm going to say now. This week, we were supposed to be moving into a discussion on parental employment and outcomes for children. I was thinking about this, though. We've been talking about this already quite a bit. And as I read the literature, I realized it's just kind of adding new dimensions to the same sort of overarching theory or theme or idea. So it's something we've been discussing for quite a while in this course already, on and off. But, before continuing down that road, I wanted to highlight this word outcome. You heard me say it just a moment ago, outcomes for children, outcome. It feels like a really important word today. Nobody's writing about this in the literature. I don't know how we got to this point, to be honest, where everything's an outcome. It's like, it just sort of happened. Now we talk about everything as an outcome. It's used all over the place. It's a new metric under what I would call neoliberal or postmodern capitalism. And I know that's a big fashionable expression, but I'll hope to try and develop it a little bit today. So, for example, we speak about today, particularly in this course, health outcomes. But we also speak about, in what I would call the neoliberal university, make no mistake, that's what we are in. That's what everybody's in the West, broadly speaking. We hear about learning outcomes. If you're working somewhere, they talk about other forms of outcomes. Outcome, we hear this word everywhere. This is what in ethics they call in the philosophy of ethics, they call it consequentialism, or a consequentialist ethics. You can see the root word is consequence. We're interested in the consequence, consequential logic, which means, in other words, that we seem to care quite a bit more about the consequences of particular actions or beliefs or practices or whatever than in the actual integrity of those practices and behaviors in of themselves. Or we care more about the consequences or outcomes than the means through which we arrive at a given outcome. We weigh it a little bit heavier. Like, for example, in a course, if you have learning outcomes in the neoliberal university, you care more about the fact that you need to be moving toward whatever those learning outcomes are, so that you can state at the end of the course that you have achieved them, and therefore plug them in to other courses and that have other learning outcomes, so that you can have a larger strategic vision within the university or something like that. So that matters much more than the process of thinking itself, which could leave us to stumble, to stammer, to go on tangents, as I often do. And to develop things maybe a bit more spontaneously based on the needs that arrive quite spontaneously within the classroom. Let's say one or two of you decided that something we were talking about on one particular day struck a chord, and it was of profound interest for you because of something else that's happening in your particular life. Well, when we plot our learning outcomes at the beginning, then we can't really take those tangents, at least not for any considerable period of time. We can't explore it in depth because we're kind of anchored to these outcomes, to the consequences that we foresee at the very beginning. But if we were to weigh things a little bit different and focus less on consequence, perhaps, and more on what's happening here and now, by chance, if we were in a classroom together, then we might be able to explore things that are of much more relevance to us in our lives right now, not because a teacher claims that it's of relevance to you before you arrived on the scene in a syllabus or something, but precisely because this particular class has a particular and singular set of interests, for example. So, I mean, I don't want to get into a huge discussion on this, except to highlight it, to draw your attention to it, to this logic of outcomes. It feels all the more important because this is a course on health. And as you move through all of your health courses, and indeed perhaps into the health field, you'll see that this word outcome or health outcomes is kind of taken for granted everywhere today. So we ask ourselves, what is it? As I said a moment ago, an outcome is a consequence. It's an effect of something. It's not the cause of something, it's the effect of something. And that's a key point. We're interested in the effect. And it's a dominant American attitude. I would say part of the American ideology, and make no mistake, Canada is a part of America. Might not be the United States of America, but we're implicated to some extent and in our own particular way in this overarching attitude that's focused on outcomes. And it's a dominant American attitude that I believe has its birthplace in the Midwest of the United States, particularly in Chicago and Michigan, in a philosophy known as pragmatism. American pragmatism, which is a key philosophy. It links up with psychology and also sociology. At the time, in the early part of the 20th century, these ideas were being explored by people such as John Dewey. It's okay if you don't know these names. I'm just throwing them out there. We're not going to fully explore their work or anything like that, but I just want you to be aware of some of the names, some of the ideas, the body of thought that gave rise to this idea of outcome in my estimation. But these people within the pragmatist tradition who were philosophers, who were psychologists, but who were also sociologists, and we can mention a few of their names. I'll mention them really quickly, but it's okay if you haven't heard of them. If you take other sociology courses, you will hear of them. Charles Horton Cooley, for example. George Herbert Mead, another one, and there's many others, but these are the major two names who were sociologists, aligned with John Dewey and William James, who were more in the field of philosophy and psychology. Well, pragmatism, it measures the truthfulness of something by way of its consequence, its utility in a sense. So make no mistake, this is the language of capitalism. It may even be capitalism at its worst, or what is most essential about capitalist logic. You measure the truthfulness based upon its consequence. Okay, so William James, John Dewey, they had this expression. I'm taking it from one of them: cash value. They call it the cash value theory of truth, and they claim it has nothing to do with money. It's just a metaphor. I submit to you that it has a lot to do with money. The metaphor actually works really well to understand the way that an economy functions, the cultural aspects of an economy, or the sociological aspects of an economy, the logic of capitalism, in other words. The cash value, in other words, whatever works. If something works, then we could say, if it fulfills a certain social need or social utility, then we can say by virtue of that, then it is truthful. You don't discern the truth before you discern its utility or its effect or its consequence within society. So if something works, if it fulfills a need, we could say that it is true in this conception, which is the pragmatist conception. Well, let me bring you back to the work of Karl Marx. I hope most of you are familiar in some way with Karl Marx. I mean, I don't know what comes to mind when I mention Karl Marx's name, but there's something that I think is really important in Karl Marx's work that I just want to highlight for a moment. Karl Marx claimed that there are two major ways to value something, to put it really simply. There are two major ways to value something, an object in the world. And I'm going to extend this principle to say also practices, social practices in the world, social relationships in the world, pretty much to value anything in the world. There's two major ways. And I'll just state what they are first, and then I'll go through what they mean. There is what he called use value, and there is what he called exchange value. Karl Marx is, of course, we would consider him a classical sociologist, but also a sociologist of economy. He was thinking about a political economic system and its social consequences. So we have two ways of valuing objects or things or relationships in the world. One is use value and the other is exchange value. Okay, so what are they? I have a drink of coffee while I think for a moment. Okay, well, use value over here is the value of an object in directly satisfying a need. Let's say a human need, to qualify it a little bit further. Use value, we're valuing something because it directly satisfies a need that we have, an intrinsic need. Note, I didn't say desire, I said need. And needs and desires are different things, right? A desire is something you want, but you don't need. You can't always get what you want, but sometimes you get what you need. Need is something you absolutely need. It's something you can't do without, in a sense. So its use value relies upon a more personal measure. Some might say more human measure, if you like, a more personal metric or measure of the value of something, and it's more qualitative. Qualitative because you're looking at the quality of the relationship or the object in satisfying our needs. It has a particular qualitative value. And that, I mean, if you've taken courses yet in qualitative methodologies, you know that a qualitative distinction is quite different from a quantitative distinction, right? So I'll give you an example. If we're talking about use value, then, and I have a teddy bear, why not? That teddy bear might be priceless to me. If it's priceless to me, then I'm saying it's priceless because I'm valuing it according to its use value. It's deeply personal to me, this particular teddy bear, perhaps because it was given to me by somebody who I care about and who cares about me. So I don't care how much money you offer me. I'm not going to sell it to you. I'm directly attached to this particular teddy bear. There might be 50 other teddy bears just like it on the market, but this one is special to me. It's a personal valuation. It's a personal way of valuing the object. Similarly, maybe my friendship to you might be valued quite qualitatively according to the world of use value, because it's personal. It's not about what you can give me or what I can get in exchange for our friendship or whatever, just personal. Maybe a loaf, to give another example, a loaf of bread is worth quite a heck of a lot of money to me because I'm hungry. Maybe, let's say I was walking in the desert and I hadn't had anything to drink for quite a long time, and then somebody has a glass of water. I would pay a fortune for that glass of water because it directly satisfies a need. It's very personal. I really need it, and I probably needed a heck of a lot more than all these other people who weren't out in the desert. Okay, so that's use value. Well, under capitalism, according to Marx, and I'm putting this very simply and naively, so I'm not being as precise as I should because we're not having a whole course on Marx, under capitalism, the world of exchange value has come to eclipse the world of use value. So let's say exchange value kind of crosses out the world of use value in a sense and takes precedent. It's now the dominant logic, the dominant way of relating to other people in the world, and the dominant way of valuing objects and behaviors and relationships and so on in the world. Exchange value. Well, the world of exchange value is capitalist reason, in a sense, or rationality, at least modern capitalism. Of course, if we want to talk about contemporary capitalism, things are quite different here. But I'm just trying to keep it as simple as I can. Well, here we're often talking more about desires, wants, fantasies, rather than needs. But it's impersonal. It's an impersonal measure of value, and it's quantitative. So what's the difference then? If it's impersonal, then it's not valued. Objects, relationships, whatever, are not valued in terms of their uniqueness in satisfying a personal need or something like that, but rather in terms of how that object or relationship, whatever it is, relates to all the other objects that exist within a market or within a system of objects, if you want to be really abstract about it. So, for example, a teddy bear is $10 because it's worth more than a loaf of bread, which is $2. And so on. So it's related to all these other objects in a market and mediated by a quantitative value, which is money, the currency of the time. So you give it a quantitative value, $10, $2. So it's quite different than exchange value, because let's say I was walking in the desert, really need water. That water's still going to be $3, that bottle of water, regardless if you're extremely thirsty or you're not. It's impersonal. It has nothing to do with your needs. A loaf of bread is $3, whether you're starving or whether you are quite well fed. It's impersonal. As they say in the world of capitalism, it's just business, nothing personal, right? So, I mean, we can give all kinds of examples from this, like. And we can also find examples in the world where use value hasn't been entirely eclipsed. And in those places, from a capitalist mindset, we might think, well, those places are corrupt places because you have to haggle and perhaps they call it bribing for particular things. Like, for example, when I was in Lebanon, I wanted to buy a shirt and there were no prices listed on the shelves. I said, how much is this shirt? The guy said to me, how much do you want to pay? Now, immediately I'm thinking, this is terrible. They can take advantage of me. And indeed they did. But it's also good in a sense, because you can make your case as to why you want to pay the price you have. I only have this much money. I'm going through a rough financial time right now. You can state your case, and people can be a little unreasonable. And being unreasonable means can sometimes work in your to your benefit. Similarly, if you make a distinction between the more quantitative aspects of the city, the more the city is ultimately run by exchange value in a naive conception, and the country or the smaller towns tend to be more personal, then let's say you need to get your car fixed. If I were in Miramichi, New Brunswick, my hometown, small town, my dad would bring the car to a guy up the street, and he would say, fix the car. I don't know, here's a bottle of rum or vodka or something, and it would get fixed. You can't do that in Toronto. You go to a shop in Toronto, they say it's $3,000 to fix this. That's just what it is. It's less personal. So this is the difference. There's countless sociologists who likewise lament the loss of the qualitative dimension of life. When a friend was a friend, not because of what that friend offered you in exchange for the friendship, like support, success, not because of your friend's utility in benefiting your life. We often talk about toxic friends, toxic family today, and so on. And it's not to discount that these people could be toxic, but it's also to demonstrate that people are human. And, like for example, a relationship today, we'll often talk about a relationship as being a good one only if they support our career, our self-growth, and so on. They can't interrupt our life, the smooth trajectory of our life. Yet that was what was once most romantic about a relationship, was the fact that it didn't fit with the logic of exchange value. Okay. And that's how it is in the world of health too. Let's say that a holistic sense of health cannot possibly be reduced to an outcome. When we speak in terms of health outcomes, we should be a little bit critical, or we should at least qualify what we mean by health outcome. Because a holistic sense is not simply about the consequence of health. We often talk about a health system that is only there to patch you up after the damage has already been done, but that is not preventative, for example. Preventative health is not consequentialist. It's not pragmatist. So when in sociology, for example, we speak about the social determinants of health, as we often do in many parts of the American academic landscape, you notice that social determinants of health as a phrase has become somewhat of a synonym for the sociology of health, when it's not clear that it necessarily is. It could even be at times a non-sociological account of health within sociology, in the sense that we don't have, when we don't have a pure conception of social health, not biological, not physiological, not medical, not psychological, but health defined socially. What is social health? We're not talking about disease or physical issues, although that could be a part of it. We're talking about health as a social health as a consequence of social determinations themselves. So not just the social determinations that cause us to have weak lungs or to suffer stress or depression and so on. We want to talk about the health of social relationships, the integrity of social relationships, rather than a simply biological consequence of social determinations. Right? When we do this, we could be eclipsing a more holistic sense of health, a more purely sociological conception of health that has everything to do with perhaps living a good life, socially speaking, now, today, and not later. We don't want to defer the health consequences. We focus instead on what has already been produced as an effect and what will inevitably produce an effect. This form of sociology, therefore, social determinants of health, consequentialist visions of health, and so on, could be problematic. There's some risk here in taking this position because it defers health. It defers health to an outcome of something else: good eating, where you live in a city, what your identity is, and so on. It's reduced health to what the German sociologist Max Weber called instrumental rationality. It's an instrumentally rational approach, which is, an ends-oriented approach. You think about the consequence again. Health is only valuable if it's a goal to be achieved, in a sense. It's forward thinking. So when we speak of, it's pretty obvious that I think this is a short-sighted approach. It's limited. It has its value, of course. It has its utility, certainly. But it's restrictive. It's a restrictive account of health, personally. And if we're going to be sociologists who are truly sociologists, in the sense that Durkheim wanted sociology to have its own unique object and methodology of study, then we should be willing to adopt a strictly sociological definition of health itself, which has been an argument that I've been trying to put forward in this course for quite some time. So when we speak of children, as the authors of the chapters for this week in the textbook have done when we speak of children as, how do they put it? Something like the recipient of health. Children as the recipients of health, or something like that. When we read statements like that, children as the recipients of health, outcomes, whatever, we're often adopting what I would call a forward-thinking perspective on children's health. A forward-thinking perspective on children's health is interested in the health of children tomorrow, the health of children as a consequence of something else. The idea is that we must bring children to good health and productivity later in life, or tomorrow, or whatever else. We think of it as an investment into health. So if we can just restructure the lives of the family, fix the work-family balance, come up with proper time management techniques, and solve all of these issues that we've been talking about in this course, then children will have better health outcomes as a consequence. I'm not saying that approach is wrong. I'm just saying it's short-sighted. It's restricted and it's limited. It doesn't cover all the ground that it could possibly cover. We need a new paradigm for the sociology of health. And I don't see it emerging. I can feel its remnants as I'm talking spontaneously in this course. I can feel aspects of where that new paradigm might need to rethink some fundamental issues. But I don't fully know what that new paradigm is yet. I know where the problems are, where the old paradigm, the current paradigm is breaking down, namely the paradigm of the social determinants of health, where we discuss health outcomes and this sort of stuff. But we haven't stopped to consider that in adopting this approach for thinking about children as the recipients of health, we perhaps are robbing them, children, of something of their health today, of an analysis of their health in the here and now, and of the analysis of the ways in which children are co-producers of their own health outcomes and not just passive recipients of health. That's possible. And it's all the more possible if we consider health measured purely sociologically as the integrity of the social bond in space and time. And by space and time, I mean how we relate to one another in space and time. We can be distant from one another. We can be away from one another for particular periods of time, and so on. That's what I mean by that abstract statement, space and time. So in this conception, children would be considered healthy, not simply in the way that they are feeling or experiencing their biology or psychology, but also more essentially because they are equipped with some sort of sociability, some sort of social connection that works for them, a social bond. At the time of the pandemic, of course, this seems all the more important because children are perhaps either today too connected to only a few social actors, their immediate family members, for example, or else they're very disconnected, or perhaps both, disconnected from their peer social networks, which are quite important, extremely important today because many children do not have siblings anymore. So there's a profound solitude to childhood today. Oh, I feel like I want to write this. It feels very important. There's a lot of literature coming out on this, cutting edge literature, childhood, let's say contemporary childhood as lonely or solitary. And those are not necessarily the same things, but those are the words that hit me as I'm thinking right now. I think we should be willing to think of childhood today as profoundly lonely, a solitary experience. There's a title of a book, The Loneliness of the Child, I think is the title, or something like that. It's a wonderful book on the psychoanalysis of children today. Put generally, based off all the empirical evidence we've discerned in this course up until now, children are often living in diverse family structures today. There's no one size fits all family today. Families are having within the, well, divorce rates and separations very high in the West today. Many families are made up of just one parent or multiple households. And so the child is alone in his or her world, connected at best to a series of screens. This has tremendous repercussions on their sociological health. The relationships are, yes, they're multiplicitous, but flat and superficial. There's no sense of fidelity any longer to friendships, and we see this more and more, less in the rural areas, of course, but friends come and go, let alone marriage and families. Children are witnessing families come together, disperse, come together, disperse, to change very quickly into new and radical forms. And the child is therefore lonely and without any siblings. Most family structures have around one child today, if at all. And they're caught into a circuit, the children are caught into a circuit of objects, exchange objects, to fill in that loneliness, that solitude, from toy to toy, upgrade to upgrade, software upgrade to upgrade, product to product, gadget to gadget, video game to video game, friend to friend. The child barely even, while moving through this circuit, barely even has time to feel and experience the truthfulness of their solitary lives and their loneliness. It's fleetingly patched up quickly as each object emerges in their purview to distract them from that loneliness and from their solitary lives. This is the psychoanalytic effect of the contemporary period on children. We have, on the one hand, what, as I've mentioned before, what Zygmunt Bauman calls the liquid family structure today. And on the other hand, we have children who are born liquid, which means they're born into a world which compels them to constantly reinvent themselves, to constantly reinvent their relationships and their ideas about the world. These are children without fixed points of view, without stability, in a sense. To be born liquid is to be born into a constant state of flux, of transformation, mutation, transition, and so on. It's the child who's born neoliberal, and neoliberal in the capitalist sense. And the rest of us, myself, are just trying to adjust to being neoliberal. The child was born neoliberal today. The rest of us are just trying to adjust ourselves to the situation. The child is the one for whom health is inherited to some extent. The child is to some extent determined by the health of his or her or their societies. Now, a field within which I'm working is psychoanalytic sociology. And psychoanalytic sociology proposes that a child's health, or rather children's suffering, is often a symptomatic response to its environment. So let's write this. Okay, so this is a fairly deep thought. What I'm saying here is that we should find within the suffering of children today a courageous response to heal itself, often inadequately, but a courageous attempt nonetheless to heal itself against a sick environment. That's the fundamental tenet, I would say, of a psychoanalytic sociology. It's the environment that's sick, not its people. So when we talk about the sickness of individuals, these are more to signal a sickness that pre-exists in the environment itself. What we're witnessing in the sickness of individuals is the agency, their agency to respond to the sickness in their environment and to try and work themselves out of it, which often they cannot do. So there's a courageous aspect to all forms of suffering and symptoms when we adopt a sociological vantage point. This is the truth of childhood health. We can measure the health of our society according to the symptoms of our children to some extent. We often think about symptoms, whatever they may be, as indications of illnesses or diseases which must be cured. That's how we tend to think of a symptom. Like, okay, you have such and such a symptom, we have to cure you of that. We get rid of the symptoms. They're indications of some sort of underlying issue within the individual. But what I'm proposing to you is that is a different vantage point. The vantage point of psychoanalytic sociology is that the child's symptoms are an indication of the child who's otherwise healthy, trying much more courageously than perhaps the rest of us or whatever else, to rise up and cure itself of environmental stress. You know, take something simple like a headache. A headache is a symptom. That's what a headache is. Well, the biological model would say that it's a symptom of some sort of physiological difficulty that might be cured by a reduction to stress. The individual should cease engaging in work for such a large period of time, less stimulation on the eyes, remove yourself from the screens, or take a pill or do some therapy, and then we'll get the symptoms will go away. But what if a headache is rather an unconscious way that the individual, the child perhaps, an unconscious way of signaling that there's just too damn much going on around us. And we introduce that pain into our own heads unconsciously as a way to cope with environmental distress, as a way to force oneself to no longer have to engage. If we have a headache, then it forces us, despite our conscious will, to not have to do the things that we feel like we have to do. It gives us an excuse to some extent to distance ourselves from an environment that just demands too much of us. Okay, well, we can think of any other number of examples if we like. The point, however, is that a symptom, speaking in psychoanalytic sociological terms, it's always, I'm going to write this. Okay. I claim that a symptom is always an individual's makeshift solution, a solution that we invent unconsciously often, we don't realize that we're inventing it, to an overarching environmental problem. The problem with our symptoms is that in our attempt to cure ourselves of the environmental problem or distress, we only introduce further problems for ourselves. Like, take the example of having a headache. If we unconsciously invented the headache as a way to distance ourselves from all of the demands that our work lives provide us, for example, it could only introduce further problems because the headache might get us into further trouble for not actually achieving all of the productivity that's being demanded of us. So it doesn't work. At best, it offers a fleeting and provisional solution, but it doesn't offer a solution that can endure in time. That's the problem with the symptom. So we can think of any number of other examples, but it's only in this restricted sense that a symptom is something to be cured. A symptom is a locus of truth about the environment. Oh, I really like that. So I'm going to write that too. A symptom is a locus of truth about the social environment. We can see, for example, now that I'm really thinking spontaneous here, but I think it's important. Let's say the headache. The headache is a locus of truth. It indexes a truth about the social environment. What is the truth? Well, today there are far too many demands placed upon workers or individuals. We have the burden of solving all of these problems for ourselves. That could be the index of truth there. So as a sociologist, we should be on the lookout for individual symptoms, yes, but also social symptoms like, is there pollution in a lake? Is there a disproportionate number of people in a group that are located in one particular area of the city, perhaps, that are suffering from stress or asthma or whatever else, or feeling suicidal? For example, I read the other day, just by chance, I just stumbled upon it while I was on YouTube, just looking at stupid videos, that in Cleveland, Ohio, they have the largest number of serial killers, when this video was published, in the world. Now, there's got to be something going on there. I don't know what it is, but it's certainly an index of an environmental truth. It's the locus of something. There's of a truth. It's a symptom of something. I don't know what, but a symptom is like a breadcrumb, right? It's asking you to follow it. Without the breadcrumb, we can't find our way. So a symptom is not pure evil. A symptom is the place of a truth. It's the locus of a truth about an environment which is sick and which demands to be cured. So sociologists often seek to look at the problems in the social structure, in the society, in the environment, and not simply, as in a social determinant of health model, eradicating the outcomes. The outcomes are the cause of our analysis in the first place. We seek there, within the poor health outcomes, an index of the issues within the social structure. And this is what social determinants of health means in some sense. So when we talk about sociology of children's health, we take everything we've already mentioned in this course and we place it within the context of a larger sociological question concerning health as such. Like, what does it mean to adopt a strictly or a purely sociological definition of health? We've already discussed the answer to that question somewhat in other classes, of course, but now we add the fact that there are things like social symptoms, that health is put sociologically as a measure of the integrity. Oh my God. Integrity of a social bond, and not, sorry, my mic is in the way. There we go. And not simply biological, psychological, or physiological health. 3, sickness understood formally or environmentally rather than in terms of particular health outcomes. For example, the environment is sick, and we simply courageously attempt to inhabit or overcome that environment. These are all, I'm just summarizing all the things I've said. And health outcomes are restrictive in themselves if they fail to take into account a life lived well, and if they, particularly in the moment, and if they fail to ascertain the overall sickness of a logic which reduces well-being to a consequentialist ethic. Of exchange value, if you like, or instrumental rationality, whatever. Okay, so this is, I think, a summary of most of the things I've highlighted up until now today. So if, like, for example, maybe I'll just write overview of themes today so far. If in chapter 17 for this week, the overarching argument was that we should, here, I'm actually quoting chapter 17 for a moment. Look, it's right at the beginning of chapter 17. The author writes, we should identify health and well-being outcomes. So if this is what's being requested of us in chapter 17, and it's the overarching frame for most of the chapters in our book, and indeed most of the sociology of health today, I think we have reason to be extremely critical of this. The way that, to put it very simply, instrumental rationality, or what I might call neoliberal capitalism, is structuring the very forms of inquiry we take when we study health. And that is sick, in a sense. That is a sickness. It's a logical sickness, because it's the sickness of our environment. And here, what you're witnessing right now, if I can be a little witty, is a symptomatic response to that sick environment right now in this classroom. So we should now see how psychoanalytic sociology, what I call psychoanalytic sociology, advances beyond and criticizes this perspective. The goal of many chapters in our textbook, including chapter 7, has been to investigate the way parental work and the work-family balance affect the child and childhood well-being. And indeed, we could clearly make cases to suggest that there is, and up to now we have done precisely that, there is evidence of this. Like, for example, more job demands certainly contribute to poor health outcomes in children and family life. I don't know how much more evidence we need from the textbook that that's the truth, but I just feel like it's just more and more evidence with more and more subtlety and nuance, but like, we get the point now. Okay, to me, it all seems fairly straightforward. Like, do we really need more research on this? I mean, I would ask the authors of the textbook, but also those who might teach courses in this area, like, how much more evidence do we really need? I don't think it's clear. It's simply about evidence. This is the problem with evidence-based thinking. Evidence-based thinking is very close to a logic of health outcomes. Evidence is an outcome, and we're just circling the evidence, which are the outcomes of our research. And this evidence, we think, can help to bolster new policy changes that have real impacts on families as a consequence. Certainly, I agree with that. It's certainly true. But perhaps we also have to identify this as a restrictive perspective, in that we need to examine the logic of the overarching social environment, because it's the environment which is sick. An environment which produces the very problems of there being a work-family balance, of liquid family structures, of the new time management techniques, and everything else that we've been discussing in this course. So my claim, and to make this claim, I intend to sidetrack much of the literature for this week. My claim is as follows: the logic of evidence-based scholarship, or outcome-based health, and learning outcomes in the neoliberal university and so on, when we think in this consequentialist way, and it's implicit in much of the American thinking on the social determinants of health, it's often, this way of studying the problem is complicit in the very structures, the very environment of ill health that those same theories and research agendas are seeking to correct, to remedy. What I'm making is a really radical claim, and I'm not sure how many of you are fully following it, because, you know, it's a new sort of claim, which implies that I can't be as precise as I'd like to be yet. But I'm just being really provocative here. And since we're approaching the end of the course, I feel like I have some license to provoke you a little bit more than I have been. If it's true that instrumental rationality, the logic of exchange, value, and so on, are now a sort of culturally dominant attitude, then as a consequence, the way we study health seems to also be trapped within that logic. That's the point I'm making. And I hope, somewhat anecdotally today, before finishing, I'm just going to say maybe a little bit more, is to demonstrate to you that that there's a lot of evidence of this, proof of this. If the environment is sick and the symptom is problems in the work-family balance and time management strategies and so on, then what is that environment that's producing this symptom? Maybe we should try and distill it, try and study that environment to get to the truth. This is what I want to develop a little bit for you now, and I admit it's going to get quite a bit more abstract from this point on for today. I want to begin by discussing a French psychoanalyst named Jacques Lacan. He died in the 1980s. He followed in the tradition of Sigmund Freud. He called for a return to Freud. And Lacan claimed that discourse is what constitutes a social bond. Discourse is what constitutes a social bond. Well, I'm just going to put this really simply for now. Discourse is just the way in which we relate to one another through meaning and language. Okay, and hopefully it's going to get a bit more clear before the end of the class. Okay, but this statement, I believe, marks Lacan, who was a psychoanalyst, it marks him as a sociologist too. He's a sociologist in this way. Put really simply, what he calls capitalist discourse, I've been calling neoliberal capitalism and all this other nonsense, he called capitalist discourse, is what constitutes a minimal, fleeting, tenuous social bond. So today, our way of relating to one another could be called a type of social bond that is named capitalist discourse, but it's a particular type of social bond that allows us to bond, yes, but in a minimal, fleeting, or really fragile, tenuous way. Our relationships are very fragile today. Capitalist discourse for Lacan is characterized by a really fast movement from one object to another object. We could say in a market, but I mean it much more culturally in terms of our relationship to objects, whether within a marketplace or not. Oh, I dropped my other laptop, sorry. So it's a fast movement from one object to another, which implies, for example, like a fast movement from one learning objective to another learning objective, one module within a syllabus to another module, one course to another, one episode on television to another episode, one upgrade to another upgrade, one dating partner on Tinder or Bumble or whatever else to another one, one gadget to another, and so on. It's a quick movement from one object to another, one relationship to another. So it's liquid, it's fluid. And the epistemological justification, when I say the word epistemology, what do I mean? Epistemological simply means, how do I put this? The means by which we consider something to be true or false, factual or fictional. Epistemology is the study, the way in which we as a society consider certain things to be true or factual and other things not to be true or factual, okay? So the epistemological, therefore, justification that capitalist discourse provides is one that does not partake in old coherencies or consistencies. We don't have a coherent social relationship or coherent theories of knowledge anymore, or consistent theories of knowledge or consistent social relationships anymore. Instead, what we have is what I've called in one of my books, American wisdom. And make no mistake, we are at some distance from America, but we are also within America. What is American wisdom? It's the epistemological justification of capitalist discourse. Sorry, I have to plug my laptop in. Okay. It's the epistemological justification of capitalist discourse. And how does it function? Well, consider for a moment the television show Grey's Anatomy. I mean, I think it began in 2005. I don't know if it's still going today, but I presume it is. I mean, it's been like a ton of episodes. I'm sure some of you have watched it. Maybe some of you are still watching it. I think the medical drama in Grey's Anatomy, it serves as a pretense to conceal as well as reveal. In other words, there's something symptomatic here. Fundamental traumatic questions that are going on within the episode. They're questions that have to do with life and death, that have to do with sexuality and relationships. And, you know, I don't want to get into all the psychoanalysis, but those particular questions, there's a reason why those are the traumatic questions in each show. Each episode, begin at the very beginning episodes, and you can really notice it. These are questions having to do with life and death, sexuality and relationships that are rendered really most palpable, witnessed as entirely unavoidable within each episode. Each episode reaches a fever pitch at the precise moment that a fundamental question concerning sexuality or mortality becomes no longer containable within the medical pretense of the plot of the show. And it's usually indicated by an intensification in the background music. You can hear it getting louder and louder and louder until it suddenly, very quickly, it dissolves. And there's just a quietness for a moment, fleeting moment. The music, all the sounds, all the talking, it comes to a dramatic and an abrupt halt. It's at this crucial moment that the individual of the show is revealed in his or her destitution, incapable of finding a solution to the problems, to the questions. These are questions that truly, as we know in psychoanalysis, do not have an answer, and that's why they plague the human being. But suddenly, at that moment, there's a calm and there's a reassuring female voice that speaks from somewhere outside of the frame to provide us all with a sort of life lesson. An essential life lesson. My claim is that we should pay really close attention to these life lessons because they reveal to us something essential about our social environment, about the American social environment. Each lesson functions as a little piece of wisdom meant to retroactively offer a remedy, however provisional, for traumatic, subjective destitution. A remedy to the experience of the trauma of not having an answer to these questions, for example, where things just don't make sense anymore. So, for example, we're treated to such life lessons as, and I'm quoting the show here, sometimes the expected simply pales in comparison to the unexpected. Sometimes it is good to be scared. It means you still have something to lose. Sometimes the future changes quickly and completely, and we're left only with the choice of what to do next. End quote. And it goes on and on. Okay, notice a few things here. Like sometimes it's good to be scared. It means you still have something to lose. That might happen in one episode. They might say that. In another episode, they might say, sometimes if you're scared, it means you have to let go of the world. So the life lesson can be contradictory. In one episode, they might say one life lesson. In another episode, they might say another life lesson that completely contradicts the lesson you just heard in the previous episode. They don't need to cohere or be consistent. There's no consistent truth. There's no coherent truth that you can string together on a thread from the first episode to the last. Instead, you have a dynamic, inconsistent mess of truths that just are there to solve in the moment the trauma that's felt. And so you have an outcome. You have, as a consequentialist epistemology that retroactively says, well, we can make sense of all of that. So I maintain that this is how capitalist discourse functions. What you had before, and now it's going to get a little bit deep, what you had before was like in a let's say a traditional society, and this is before we had the shift into the liquid family form. This is really before, I would say, the 1980s. It's signaled by after the 1980s by people like Thatcher, Reagan. I don't think I spelled that right. I don't know. I think it's Xiao Peng in China. And so on. In other words, the time of neoliberal capitalism, where the way capitalism functioned completely morphed and changed after the 1980s. But before the 1980s, you had universal prohibitions. And a universal prohibition is quite different than what we're hearing in Grey's Anatomy. So a universal prohibition, if that's our epistemology, the way it functioned was it would say, like, you shall not, what? You shall not enjoy something. It universally prohibited you. This was the old function of the law. Like a universal prohibition means you under no circumstance can do this particular thing. If you want to think of the old tablets of the law in Judaism, for example, you shall not covet thy neighbor's wife. It's a prohibition under all circumstances of enjoying something. In this case, your neighbor's wife, which is, it's one of the inscriptions. What can I say? Universal prohibitions. You can think of the old laws. The old laws would say you can't do this, you can't do that. And we felt it. We felt like we were prohibited from certain things. You can't steal something from a shop. You can't just freely enjoy the products that are on the shelves at a shop, for example. These are universal prohibitions. So the statement is, you shall not enjoy. So you feel like because of the prohibition, you're losing some enjoyment. It's been taken from you. And this is why a lot of social movements before and around the 1980s would rise up and say, well, you know what, we want some enjoyment here. We want to be able to transgress these prohibitions. We don't like the rules. We should be free without rules, for example. But instead, what we have today is not a logic of universal prohibitions. What capitalist discourse provides today are what I call particular affirmations. Instead of universal prohibitions, we now have particular affirmations. So we've changed. What are particular affirmations? It's like the maternal cinematic voice that we've heard in Grey's Anatomy. It speaks to us through these particular affirmations. It's a shift from the universal prohibition of enjoyment to a particular affirmative injunction to enjoy. You must enjoy. So instead of you shall not enjoy, what we hear today is you're perfectly justified. Sometimes it is okay that, or maybe you should something. These are the statements that are the epitome of the law today within culture. So these sort of personal wisdoms and life, I mean, those quotes that I gave you from Grey's Anatomy, they all began with sometimes ... And we can think of all kinds of examples because they tend to be, for quite some time now, littered across the social media walls of our friends and colleagues, and perhaps we also post them, and our family members. People will write things like sometimes ... these personal sort of life lessons. There's numerous examples of how these personal wisdoms sort of work in American aesthetic culture. Take as another example the Coca-Cola bottle. One aspect of the Coca-Cola bottle is, of course, that it seems to suggest that we must be enjoying ourselves. But what's really happening? I don't know how many of you have seen these Coca-Cola bottles around the holidays in commercials. It tends to be like a family of polar bears that come together around the Coca-Cola bottle as if it's a totem pole. And indeed it is. Its function is to form a social relationship based upon the enjoyment of a commodity. So it's quite different from the cultural logic of a prohibition, right? It's saying you must enjoy this product if you want to have a social bond with your family members around the holidays, for example. But it goes even further than this. I don't know if you've noticed in the last few years, there's a new Coca-Cola campaign that it will list the names of particular people that you may have a social relationship with on the side of the bottle. Like, for example, you'll buy a Coca-Cola bottle, it'll say soulmate, and you buy it and you drink it with your partner. Why? To establish a social relationship with your partner through the Coca-Cola bottle. Now you're my soulmate, we drink it together. It literally, the commodity form produces the social relationship. And what it does so in a tenuous way. Like whenever that bottle is finished, you need to go, perhaps, the logic is go buy another bottle to rebuild the social relationship. Otherwise, you won't have one. So you can only have a social relationship through the commodity form, through exchange value, through capitalism. So you can always purchase another bottle to repair a rupture in the social bond. Another example, I'll just give you a whole bunch of examples because this is a really deep sort of thought. I don't know if you're familiar with word art, but word art is a growing trend, and I've documented its rise. There's entire department stores that are built to sell you word art. I would be surprised, I should check into it, but I think Winners and HomeSense, especially HomeSense, makes a significant percentage of its income purely off of the sale of word art. Of course, there's entire rows at Walmart and so many other places, and we're all victims of this. We'll buy word art and we'll put it on our walls, or it'll be on our pillows, or it'll be like a statue we put on our coffee tables, or on our oven mitts, whatever else. It's really the historical equivalent of what we used to call kitsch, these knickknacks that used to express, the simple wisdom in our homes, like home is where the heart is. But if you go to the decor section of any American department store today, you're going to find all this stuff. These are from Walmart. I actually have a list of them. Love every moment, laugh every day, live beyond words. It's telling you to enjoy yourself. Never stop dreaming. These are affirmations. Smiles, laughter, sometimes tears. You see, these are justifications, affirmations of you being you. You be you. Similar forms of word art can be found today to give you another example, in bookstores. The poetry section of a bookstore now, people are not buying, the bestseller is not like the poetry of Charles Baudelaire. It's instead the poetry of Rupi Kaur, for example. And if you look at Rupi Kaur, these poems are just American wisdom. You flip the page and there's always an image in the background. That's important because it's not a symbolic poem. It's ultimately meant to be an imaginary construction. Like, for example, here's a poem from Rupi Kaur. If you were broken and they have left you, do not question whether you were enough. The problem was that you were so enough, they were not able to carry it. And then, of course, there's always like a little signature at the bottom, Rupi Kaur. It's an affirmation, a particular affirmation. It's the same sort of capitalist discourse, the same sort of epistemology of capitalism. In every case, we're witnessing a desperate attempt toward the particular affirmative maternal voice, in the same way that we saw in Grey's Anatomy. I'm thinking spontaneously of the growing trend also I saw in the newspaper. I was reading it, I think it was in the New York Times last year, about Instagram poets. People make money off of this now. It's part of the influencer campaign. They'll create their own particular affirmation, like love your mother. She was always there, even when you weren't, or something like that, or like your wound is not a wound, but the place from which a beautiful flower can grow. It is soil, period. And then you put your little name. I just invented that. You can put that on the internet. This is how it works, and they'll curate entire sums of particular affirmations, and they can be freely traded and shared on the internet in this way. You can find them on Pinterest, everywhere. American wisdom works like this. It keeps moving like this. When one piece of wisdom loses its luster, there's always another one prepared in advance to replace it, as a cheap substitute, to be purchased in advance to replace it. Its function is always to establish a justification for something that's confusing, for something we cannot deal with. In other words, a rupture in our social bond. It doesn't disrupt the ego. It retroactively affirms the ego and the particular circumstance of each individual. And it does so faster and faster. It's not coherent. It's not consistent. Each wisdom can contradict another. You just pick the one that justifies you and makes you feel good. This is the circuit of capitalist discourse. It's an upgrade on the old logic of Marxist exchange value. It's an upgrade on Max Weber's logic of instrumental rationality, but in a very precise way. It moves fast. There's no obstacles here. You don't feel prohibited. You enjoy yourself freely. In fact, you are compelled. You are told you must enjoy yourself. You're forced to enjoy yourself at the level of this fast-moving circuit of objects. Like, for example, I was thinking the other day about how, like, the old, like, if you were in a marriage and you cheated on your partner, let's say 20, 30 years ago, you would go to your psychoanalyst and say, help me. I can't help but transgress. I can't help. Like, I just want to go out and enjoy myself. I love my wife or my boy, my husband or whomever, but I can't. And the therapist would say, well, you have a pathology. You need to be dedicated to your partner. Don't do that. It's really interesting what has changed in recent history. What's changed is that if you go to your psychotherapist, psychoanalyst today, psychiatrist, whatever, it's quite likely if you say I'm cheating on my partner. No, if you say I'm so in love with my partner, like I love my partner deeply, and she's all I can think about, or he's all I can think about, or whatever. Your therapist might say you have fixations, you have dogmatic fixations. You need to go out and be open-minded and experience the world and reconfigure your sexual life and be, but the idea is that if you're not enjoying yourself today, if you're actually prohibiting yourself from enjoyment and buckling down to one partner, for example, or one idea, like if you're just a Marxist, then you're sick. Capitalist discourse compels you to enjoy yourself, and if you do not, it's a pathology today. Anyway, I can feel myself rambling. I'm just going to try and wrap it up. I had a lot more thoughts I wanted to share with you, but I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna bring it to a close. Capitalist discourse is the name we give to the environment through which the subjects today seem to find themselves, particularly children who are born into this world. It's liquid in the sense that it shifts and it mutates in all sorts of interesting ways. And ultimately, I would say it's an environment of addictions. So when people are addicted today, and I understand addictions broadly, sociologically, not simply addicted to drugs or sex or whatever else. It could be any type of addiction, addicted to learning, always another course, addicted to a television show, addicted to dating, whatever. Addictions is understood much more broadly according to the logic of capitalist discourse. When somebody's addicted today, we fault them, and they are suffering. But what are they suffering from? Their environments. They're merely enacting the environmental demands upon themselves. They're merely giving in to them, in a sense. Whether it's an addiction to fast food or lovers, whatever it is. addictions are pervasive in this strict sociological, psychoanalytic sociological sense. It's perhaps even the sickness of our time. And the subject is simply struggling within this, and the subject, the individual, the child, all of us are simply trying to work our way through this sickness in any way we can. I'll just end with a concluding thought. The capitalist discourse is so cunning that it's even invented a way to protect itself from burning out in a cycle of addictions. Like, it will offer you a temporary way out, which is not really a way out. I'll give you an example. It's a temporary, instead of a universal prohibition, it'll give you a particular prohibition. A couple of years ago, there was a phone that was put on the market called the Light phone. It was like 800, 900 Canadian dollars, around the same or more expensive than the iPhone at the time. And it was marketed as the phone away from phone. It was meant to be your second phone. And the way it works is that you buy this phone, it's at the outrageous sum of money, but you're buying it because of what it doesn't allow you to do. It doesn't allow you to enjoy yourself. All you can do on the phone, you can look it up, it's called Light phone. I think they have Light phone 2 now. All you can do on the phone is make phone calls and send a text message. It won't allow you to play games. It won't allow you to go on social media or install any apps and so on. So people buy this phone and they're willing to spend a heck of a lot of money to temporarily interrupt the circuit, the fast-moving circuit of addictions, which is capitalist discourse. You know, you have this phone, then you'll have another phone, and your other phone will just temporarily allow you to put that other phone away. You know, maybe you go on holiday, but then you come back to the other phone. It never says you should get rid of your first phone. It's your phone away from phone. Similarly, today, there's all kinds of apps that are being sold to academics. I swear I'm going to stop after this thought. These are apps, I can't remember what they're called. I should have done my research before I talked today, but basically what they do is you set a timer on them, and it'll bring up a notepad, and it won't allow you to engage with anything else on your screen, on your computer. It'll block out all the stimulus, all the possible avenues of enjoyment, and it will prohibit them temporarily. You set a timer, and then you can get some work done. I first learned of this when I went to a conference in California a few summers ago. These are all like Ivy League professors in America and so on, and they had endless seminars about strategies to focus. And these strategies are ultimately about buying gadgets and objects and tools that will temporarily relieve you of the burden of having to enjoy yourself. But they didn't recognize it as such. You know, they're like a fish in water. They breathe in the capitalist environment without knowing that they are in it. You know, this is just their response to their environment. I'm going to stop here. I can feel myself talking too much. I hope you're all doing well, and I apologize for the eccentric topics today, but I thought it would be worth going in this direction a little bit. So we'll see how it goes. You will see me in a week. If you have any questions or comments, anything that you're struggling through, please don't hesitate to shoot me an email or something, and we can work through it together. Okay. All right. Bye-bye.